Hi, I'm Johnny from ultimatepapermache.com, and I'm going to do an experiment today that I probably should have done a whole long time ago. At least like once or twice or 3 times a week for like the last 10 years, people have been asking me if you could make paper mache clay using plaster of Paris instead of the pre-mixed drywall joint compound. The reason for that, I think, is that in some countries they don't build houses with sheets of drywall, so you can't go to the store and buy drywall joint compound because there's no need for it there. So but everybody has plaster of Paris. That's just something that you can find in any country. That's what this stuff is. You can just buy it at the hardware store. It's cheap. But does it work in paper mache clay? And every time somebody asks me that, I have always in the past said, I don't know. Go ahead and try it. Find out. There's a real good possibility, though, that it's going to get hard in the bowl and you won't be able to actually have time to do any sculpting with it. The original recipe for paper mache clay that does use the pre-mixed drywall joint compound dries slowly. But it's a good thing that it dries slowly because it gives you time to actually do your sculpting and spread it over your armature without having to worry about it clumping up and getting hard in the bowl. Plaster of Paris, maybe it won't do that. And maybe it will, but the only way to find out is to test it. So we're going to find out today. I intended to do the whole experiment right in front of you guys without doing any testing at all, but I kind of chickened out. So I did do a really fast run through yesterday, but instead of using the original paper mache clay recipe without the drywall joint compound, I used the silky smooth air dry clay recipe instead. And the only reason for that is because I'm lazy. I wanted to use a small batch. It just naturally makes about half the size of the regular paper mache clay recipe. And everything is, all of the ingredients are half a cup. That's really easy for me, even though I'm math phobic, to cut that in half. And so it was just really easy for me to run through that particular project. So I mixed it up and I found out some things that I'm going to use today when I'm testing the original paper mache clay recipe. But the results with the air dry clay, this is my samples that I did. I was able to keep using it and making changes to my little slabs here for at least a couple of hours. If you were using the drywall joint compound, you'd just be, if you had any left over, you just go ahead and cover it up really well, and you can use it again the next day, or maybe even for a week or more before you start seeing any changes in it at all. This stuff was hard in the bowl after sitting there overnight. So this is it. Obviously, you can't sculpt with that. It's not dry. It's probably going to take a really long time to dry, but it's hard and you can't use it. So that's a really big difference, and I expect that when we try the original paper mache clay recipe, that's going to be the same thing. So even if you want to do this experiment yourself, don't expect it to last. Just make enough that you'll be able to use in a couple of hours. The other thing that's really different is that the air dry clay recipe called for some flour that you add at the end in order to make it as stiff as you want it. You can add as much or as little as you want to, depending on how you like to work. But I couldn't add any flour, any of the extra flour, because we learned in the experiment I did yesterday that it can't take the extra flour. Today, when I put the ingredients for a really small batch of the original paper mache clay recipe, I didn't put any flour in it at all. And I'm going to mix my plaster right in here. If you want to mix plaster the right way, you put the water in your bowl and then sift your plaster on top of it. Let it sit for just a little while so that the water can soak into the plaster, and then you mix it up. I'm not going to bother doing that. I'm way too lazy for that. And I'm not going to use a bowl. I'm just going to cheat and put it in this plastic bag. So I'm just going to throw everything in there. Just going to mix it up. You want to mix it up as well as you can because you don't want any like lumps or anything. This is going in a bowl of water that I've got down on my floor. And we've got the flour here so that we can add some if it needs it. I think it will, but no way to know until we get it started here. So this is what it's like without the flour. If you wanted a really, really thin layer on something, this would be right at the point where that would work. I'm going to add just a little bit of flour. Really little bit. Just like that. A little more. Okay, that's good enough. Now these beaters are going to go in that bowl with the water. I'm going to wash them out in that bowl, and the water goes out in the snow. It does not go in the sink. Now let's try smearing some on our cardboard again, so I'll be doing the same thing I did yesterday. Okay, it's about 8:35 right now. And I'm going to keep watching this. I'll come back every like 10 or 15 minutes and just to see if it's still workable. It's about 9 o'clock right now. The plaster that was left over is still not hard, so the paper mache clay shouldn't be either. Let's check it. And yep, it is still movable. You can still push it around. I should have my water. I don't know what happened to it because it would make it a lot easier if this was wet. But you can move it around. You can make changes to it. You can still sculpt with it. So at, let's see, that was 25 minutes and it's still okay. So let's leave it a little bit longer. I'm going to watch this leftover plaster, and as soon as it starts getting hard, I'll come back and we'll see what happened to the paper mache clay. So now it's been, what, about 35 minutes? It's 9:12 now. It hasn't been very long since I was here last, but the plaster is starting to harden up. I can still squish it, but it's definitely setting up. So what is happening to our paper mache clay with the plaster in it? Let's see. It's definitely stiffer, but I can still move it around. It's not hard in the bowl, so this should be possible. Still working. So I'll give it another half hour and we'll see what happens then. Okay, now it's 9:26, so our material has been mixed up for about an hour now. The plaster of Paris, in the leftover parts, quite hard. You can't mold it in any way. So let's see what happens with our paper mache clay. Has it been affected at all? We'll see. I remembered to get my knife a little bit damp this time, just to make it easier. So we can still sculpt with it. We can still make a little like fur if you wanted to, eyebrows, whatever. You can still spread it over an armature. Now, because of the experiment I did yesterday, I have absolutely no expectation at all of this being usable tomorrow. This is going to be a lump in the morning when I get up. It's just not going to stay usable the way it would if we were using the pre-mixed drywall junk compound. But we have discovered that it is usable for at least an hour. I'm gonna come back in about an hour from now just to make one last check to see maybe if it lasts for 2 hours. That would be enough to make it worthwhile mixing up a small batch. So now it's 10:37. It's exactly 2 hours since I mixed this up. Let's see what happens. I don't know if it's focusing or not. It's definitely stiffer than it was, but it is still actually sculptable. It's actually stiffening up really slow, almost like epoxy clay does, where you can spread things out really easy when it's really soft right at the beginning, and then as it starts to stiffen up, you can do more details. The stuff that's in the bowl here, it's definitely stiffening up. I'm going to check just one more thing. I'm going to see if I can spread this out. It's 2 hours and it's still working. My knife has gotten dry, so it's not smoothing it on as easily as it should, but that's the knife's fault, not the paper mache clay. So now we know it actually works. I was not expecting it to. I really wasn't. The glue must be slowing down the curing of the plaster of Paris. Is it better than the original paper mache clay recipe? I'm going to say no. If you actually have the drywall joint compound available near you, I would say definitely use the original paper mache clay recipe with the pre-mixed drywall joint compound, because it just feels a little bit different. I just like it the way it works just a little bit better. But if that's not the case, if you can't get it, or if you happen to have some plaster in the house and you don't want to go to the store for the drywall joint compound, go ahead and use it and give it a try. Mix up a small batch because you won't be able to use it for very long. This is getting stiff enough now that I'm kind of figuring that 2.5 to 3 hours is definitely going to be your max of how long you can use it. And obviously you're going to have to throw out anything that's left over and start over with a new batch the next time. So make a really small batch if you're using the plaster, and then use it right away. Don't like sit it on the counter and wander back 4 hours later. That's probably not going to work. So now I have a video that I can point everybody to. I know people are still going to be asking me if you can use plaster of Paris, and now I can say, hey, yeah, but go watch this video first, because there are some things to know about it. Now, that I used exactly the same proportions that were in the original paper mache clay recipe, except for substituting out the plaster of Paris. I mixed the plaster of Paris at 2 to 1, 2 parts of plaster, 1 part of water, and then measured it to make sure that I had the same amount that I would have used the drywall joint compound. You'll find the recipes for the original paper mache clay recipe and the silky smooth air dry clay recipe that I practiced with yesterday. You can use the plaster in both of them. We already know that it works now because I've tested it out. Again, not for very long, but you can use it for a reasonable amount of time with either one of those recipes. You can find both of them at ultimatepapermache.com/recipes. So anytime you're looking for any of my recipes, that's where you want to go. Now go make something and then come back and visit me, ultimatepapermache.com.